Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we will explore and attempt to resolve the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 11. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're reading the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter, and each of these issues impacts how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 11, the top 3 issues are the meaning of verse 5, the meaning of verse 3, and the meaning of the sentence in verse 1 about birds and fleeing. The first issue we'll look at is in verse 5. The Lord refines the righteous person, but his soul hates the wicked person who loves violence. The issue here is one of text division. Where does the first line clause end, and where does the second line or clause begin? We can illustrate the two main options by looking at other translations. The NIV, for example, says, "The Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked, those who love violence, he hates with a passion." The first line ends with the word righteous, and the second line starts with the wicked. The NLT, on the other hand, groups the wicked with the first line. The Lord examines both the righteous and the wicked. So according to the NIV, the verse presents a contrast. The Lord examines the righteous, and he does not examine the wicked. Instead, he hates them. But according to the NLT, the Lord does examine the wicked, alongside the righteous. When we look at some other translations, we find a fairly even split, some on the same side as the NIV and others on the same side as the NLT. Let's look now at the Hebrew text to see what these translations are doing. The Hebrew text reads, Adonai tzadik yivchan, v'rasha v'ohev chamas sana'a nafsho. According to the NIV and others, the text should be divided between yivchan, tests, examines, or refines, and rasha, and the wicked. But according to the NLT and others, the text should be divided between v'rasha, and the wicked, and v'ohev, and the one who loves. We'll try to summarize the arguments for both views so that you can come to your own conclusion. Let's start with the view of the NIV and others. The first argument for this view is that it's how the received Hebrew text has traditionally been understood. The final vowel on the word yivchan is lengthened from a patach to a kametz, which means that it marks the end of a unit. And this coincides with the division according to the Masoretic accents. The word yivchan has the accent known as ole v'yored, and this accent marks the strongest division within this verse. Also, when we look at some Hebrew manuscripts of this verse, for example, the Aleppo Codex, we find the text divided in the same way. The oldest manuscripts of Jerome's translation and the translation of the Syriac Peshitta are similarly divided at this point. A second argument for this view is based on word order. It would be very odd to have the two objects, righteous and wicked, separated by a verb. Furthermore, the fronting of the object, the righteous one, suggests that it is in marked focus, which implies exclusivity. It is the righteous one and no one else whom the Lord refines. He does not refine the wicked. So the word order is a strong argument for this division of the verse, and it goes hand in hand with the next argument, that the verse is best interpreted as presenting an antithesis. Righteous and wicked are opposites, and the point of the verse is to describe how the Lord treats each. It is the righteous one whom the Lord refines. By contrast, he hates the wicked one, who loves violence. In our view, these three arguments, tradition, word order, and antithesis, make this division of the verse the most likely. The main argument against this division of the verse is based on the balance of the lines. If we adopt this division, then the lines are imbalanced, 3 words and 6 syllables in the A line, and 5 words and 12 syllables in the B line. The B line's nearly twice the length of the A line. By contrast, if we divide the text differently, as the NLT and others do, then the lines are balanced. 4 words and 9 syllables, 4 words and 10 syllables. This division of the text is attractive because Hebrew poetry does tend to prefer lines that are balanced. However, there are other examples of imbalanced lines. Hebrew poetry tends to prefer balance, but it's not required. Another argument for this alternative division is based on the tradition of the Old Greek translation of Psalms, which divided the text in the same way. The Lord examines the righteous and the impious, break, but he who loves injustice hates his own soul. It's possible that this represents an even older tradition of division than what we find in the traditional Hebrew text. But you'll notice that the Greek text actually has to alter the word order in order to get its reading. It's possible that the Hebrew manuscript read by the Greek translators actually had a different word order. This possibility is supported by the fact that the Syriac Peshitta has the same word order. But the point is that, as we've suggested, and as the Greek translation may imply, this division of the text only works if you rearrange the order of the words. And that argument is difficult to make. One last argument for the alternative division is based on the immediate context. The previous verse said that the Lord's eyelids test humans. The word for test in this verse is the same word as we have in the next line. The Lord refines or tests the righteous. If, according to verse 4, the Lord tests all humans, then it makes sense that verse 5 should say that the Lord tests both the righteous and the wicked, and not just the righteous. If verse 5 says that the Lord tests only the righteous, then this would seem to contradict the previous line, which says that the Lord tests all people. But the word bachan has multiple meanings. The word comes from the world of metallurgy. Just as a metal worker might put metal in the fire to examine its quality or to refine it, so this word can refer to testing and examining or to refining. Verse 4 says that the Lord tests all people in order to see what they're made of. He examines them. And verse 5 says that the Lord tests the righteous in a special way. He refines them. By contrast, he hates the wicked, and he doesn't refine them. In conclusion, we've chosen to render the verse, "The Lord refines the righteous person, but his soul hates the wicked person who loves violence." And this division is actually crucial to the message of the psalm. In Psalm 11, David is under attack, and his advisors argue that he ought to escape while he can. But David sees the enemy's attack in a different light. The Lord is at work, refining his people. The flames may be hot, but they are not intended to destroy. They are meant to refine. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B+ rating. The second of our top 3 issues is found in verse 3, which we've translated, "For the foundations are about to be destroyed. What has the righteous person done?" Now, our translation differs here from most other modern translations. The ESV, for example, says, "If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" According to the ESV and these other translations, the verse consists of one conditional sentence with the if clause in verse 3a and the then clause in verse 3b. The Hebrew text reads, "Ki hashatot yeharesun tzadik ma'pa'al." The different translations of this text are due to different interpretations of the ki, different interpretations of the verb forms, especially the verb at the end of the verse, pa'al, and different interpretations of what the verse means and how it fits in the context. Part of the difficulty is to be found in the fact that the word shatot, which is definite, hashatot, occurs only in this one instance. But most agree that it means something like foundations. Some interpret this literally, as in foundations of an architectural structure, perhaps a city wall, and others interpret it figuratively, as in the foundations of law and order. The immediately preceding verses suggest that we're talking about literal foundations. In verse 1, David's men call him a bird. In some other ancient Near Eastern texts, besieged kings are referred to as trapped birds, and when they flee, they're sometimes said to be like birds fleeing to the mountains. In verse 2, David's men warn that the wicked are about to bend the bow, and bows were critical in siege warfare. They've put their arrows in place on the string in order to shoot in deep darkness at those who are upright in heart. In other words, the enemy is preparing for an assault. The mention of foundations in verse 3 fits right into this context of a siege. The fortifications of a city had foundations, and in the event of a successful attack, these foundations were destroyed. This understanding of the context will help us to better understand the syntactic structure and meaning of verse 3. The verse begins with ki, and there are 2 ways to interpret this ki. It could be connected to what came before, perhaps giving a reason or explanation for something just said, as we've interpreted it, or it could be connected to what comes after. For example, if or when the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Most translations take the second of these options, and ki can and often does function in this way. This would also be consistent with the prefixed or yiktol form of the verb yeharesun, colored here in pink. The problem with this interpretation is that it forces an unusual meaning on the final katal verb, colored here in blue. Katal is usually past tense and indicative. What did the righteous one do, or what has the righteous one done? Future tense and irrealis are usually indicated by yiktol, not katal. If the psalmist wanted to say, what can the righteous one do? He probably would have used a yiktol and not a katal. For this reason, it's better to interpret the key as a causal conjunction, giving a reason for what came before. Flee because the foundations will be or are about to be destroyed. This interpretation of the key clause in verse 3 is also consistent with how we've interpreted the previous clause, verse 2. Verse 2, like verse 3, begins with key, which is followed by a yiktol verb and a katal verb in the next line. Most translations interpret the key in verse 2 as causal and the key in verse 3 as conditional, but the parallels between verse 2 and verse 3 suggest that the keys and the verbs in both clauses should be read in the same way, and so the context lends some additional support to our interpretation. This now leaves a question about the second half of verse 3. Who is the righteous one? And what is meant by the question, what has he done? Some have suggested that the righteous one refers to the Lord. But this is unlikely, seeing that when the word tzaddik is used as a noun, it almost always refers to people, as it does, for example, in verse 5 of this psalm. It's more likely that the righteous one refers to David. Or even more likely, the word tzaddik may be a collective, the righteous people generally, which would include David. In either case, the question might mean, what has the righteous done to deserve this? With the expected answer being nothing. And this question sets up David's response in the rest of the psalm. By asking this question, David's men are really questioning the justice of God. The wicked ones, they say, are shooting at the righteous ones and they get away with it. Meanwhile, the righteous who are under attack have done nothing wrong. In verses 4 to 7, David argues that the Lord is just. He loves the righteous and he is refining them, and in the end, they will see his face. As for the wicked, he hates them, and he will destroy them in the end. We give our interpretation of verse 3 a B rating. The last of our top 3 issues is the meaning of a sentence in the first verse. Flee to your mountain, birds. There are a number of issues involved in the interpretation of this verse. Text critical, grammatical, and semantic. We'll break them down one at a time, starting with the text critical issue. Our translation, like the NIV and others, has the word your mountain. But other translations don't. The Net, for example, has flee to a mountain. The issue has to do with the text being translated. The NIV is a translation of the Masoretic text, which has a second-person plural pronoun, your mountain. The Net, and most other modern translations, are inferring the existence of a Hebrew text different from and earlier than the Masoretic text, based on the evidence of the ancient versions. So the ancient versions have flee to a mountain like a bird. It's probable that they read the text as Nudi har komotsipur. According to some scholars, this reading represents the original text, and the Masoretic text is secondary at this point. Somewhere in the history of transmission, Nudi har komotsipur became Nudu har chemtsipur. In our project, we've decided to build as much as we can on the excellent resource of Dominique Barthélemy's Textual Criticism of the Old Testament, a resource designed in part to aid Bible translations. Barthélémy argues that the Masoretic text reading is probably correct here. It's the more difficult reading, and it's easy to explain how the easier reading of the versions came about because of it. By contrast, it's hard to imagine how the reading of the Masoretic text could have originated from the simple and straightforward reading attested by the versions. The plural suffix, your mountain, probably refers to David and those who are with him, perhaps his family. If we choose to follow the Masoretic text, we're still left with an unresolved problem, because the Masoretic text itself gives us 2 different readings. The text is written as a second masculine plural imperative, nudu, but it is read as a second feminine singular imperative, nudi. All of the ancient versions, along with our oldest Hebrew witness from Qumran, attest to the second feminine singular reading, nudi. Again, however, we follow the work of Barthélémy, who argues convincingly that the masculine plural form, that which is written in the Masoretic text, is the older reading. The feminine singular form probably came about because my soul, in the previous line, is feminine singular. So now we have a text to work with, but there are still grammatical and semantic issues to resolve. The Hebrew text of this clause has 3 words: flee, your mountain, and birds. Nudu, harchem, tzipor. And it's not clear how the 3 words relate to each other syntactically. The word bird, or birds, could be read either as an adverbial, like a bird, or as a vocative. The NIV reads it adverbially: flee like a bird to your mountain. If we were to diagram this sentence, tzipor would go under the main line, modifying the verb for flee. Literally, the text would say, flee a bird, and it would mean something like flee like a bird. The 1917 JPS translation reads, flee thou to your mountain, ye birds. It has chosen to treat birds not as an adverbial accusative, like a bird, but instead as a vocative. Both interpretations are possible, but the vocative interpretation seems more likely. The word bird or birds looks in the sentence exactly how we would expect a vocative to look, without any affixes, without any prepositional phrases, and sitting at the end of the clause. By contrast, the normal way of expressing a comparison in Hebrew is to use the preposition kaf. If the psalmist wanted to say unambiguously, like a bird, he could have said katzipor. And so tzipor here is more likely a vocative. Now it's true that tzipor is singular, while the verb is plural. But tzipor in the singular sometimes functions as a collective, referring to a group of birds, as in Psalm 8. This interpretation of tzipor as a vocative has significant exegetical implications. David's men are not just suggesting that his flight should be bird-like, swift and silent, but that he and those who are with him are, in some sense, birds who are about to be trapped by a hunter. If birds is a vocative, then what is your mountain doing in the sentence? There's little doubt here that your mountain is adverbial, indicating the direction of the flight. The question is whether the flight is from the mountain or to the mountain. While some have argued that the text should be interpreted flee from your mountain, virtually all translations, ancient and modern, say flee to your mountain, indicating the goal of flight. And this is probably correct. Whenever verbs of motion, including verbs of fleeing, are modified by an adverbial accusative, the accusative almost always indicates the direction in which someone flees. Furthermore, the image of a bird seeking shelter in the mountains is a common motif in the biblical and broader ancient Near Eastern world. So in conclusion, we have rendered this clause as, flee to your mountain, birds. We give this interpretation a B rating. Each of these 3 exegetical issues plays a crucial role in our overall interpretation of the psalm. In verse 1, David's advisors call him and those with him birds. That is, they suggest that they are like birds being hunted, and if they don't flee to the mountains for shelter, then they will be trapped like birds. The advisors go on to give 2 reasons why David should flee while he can. One is because the wicked are preparing for an attack, verse 2. The second is because the foundations of the city wall or the city citadel are about to be destroyed. Then they ask a question in verse 3 that challenges God's justice. What has the righteous one done to deserve this? David responds in the following verses with the defense of God's justice. In verse 5, he tells them, the Lord refines the righteous one, but his soul hates the wicked one who loves violence. David sees the Lord at work in this crisis, not with the intention of destroying his people, but of refining them. The Lord disciplines those whom he loves, and they, those who have been purified, will see his face in the end. This has been the top 3 exegetical issues for Psalm 11. Thanks for watching.